my name is Peter Hilton, and I'm going to talk today about flat API design. When I started writing this talk, it was flat API documentation for HTTP APIs. But as I got through the writing of the presentation, I realized that this was as much about API design as it is about API documentation. But I started with documentation. I started because although I've worked with web backends, web services for many years, this year was the first time that I inherited being the editor as a technical writer of public API documentation for an HTTP API. And I learned a few things, mostly that other people's APIs are horrible and that the documentation isn't very good. And so I spent a bit of time thinking about, well, why is this and what can I do about it? What I want out of these APIs, are two things. I want the docs to be good, because nobody's got time for bad docs. Also, I like writing documentation. I know that's only me, but I do. I mean, writing docs is my happy place. But I also want the APIs to be good. And these two things are really just the same thing. They are one thing, which is that I want good developer experience. See, user experience is not a new thing anymore. Developer experience is the future, because developers are people too. To start with, I'm going to consider why it is that we as developers deconstruct APIs. We get APIs and we split them into lots of little bits. We're used to API docs looking a bit like this. So this is from the Java doc. I mean, it's in Russian because I don't want you to really focus on the text, but you recognize the structure. You recognize that there are names, parameters, descriptions, these kinds of things, and these are separated in the documentation. This works pretty well for a Java API. It's not appropriate for everything. So one of my books on my bookshelf at home is this quite cute phrase book called Making Friends in English. And it's a phrase book that goes beyond how to order tickets at the bus station to how to socialize at parties and what to say in a pub in London. Page 27 has this little dialogue where Mark introduces his friend Raoul to people at a party. This shows you, by example, how to have this kind of conversation. What if developers wrote phrase books? Developers wrote phrase books like they write API docs. This would look like this. It would deconstruct the conversation into its parts. It would introduce new concepts, abstract concepts, so things like the target of the introduction, the subject who is doing the introducing, or is it the other way around? Who even knows? It does everything except show you how to actually have the conversation. This works if you already know how to do it, and it reminds you, maybe, but it is not useful if you're learning. So here's another example. Flowers are pretty. I like flowers. I like a bunch of flowers. But as a developer, I do find this very satisfying. The deconstruction of the bunch of flowers into its component parts, neatly laid out. This is my happy place for documentation, when everything is neat and tidy. See, this is a very normal perspective for a developer. But it's funny because it's not normal in real life. So here I've learned two things. Programmers like to deconstruct things, and Swiss artist Ursus Rarely, who made this flower deconstruction and has a whole book of others, he is a genius. And obviously a programmer, obviously an API developer. So this is deconstructed documentation, a deconstructed API. But what is wrong with this? Why do I care? Why do you care? I want you to care because there's a problem. This works well for Java, does not work well for HTTP. Now, HTTP, the web, is not new, but it's gradually been taking over just about everything. So I wasn't sad when web pages took over CD-ROMs, because every CD-ROM reinvented every aspect of the user interface, and I couldn't even find the scroll bars. I mean, that's kind of happening with web now, but that's another story. Lots of other things got replaced with the web version of the same thing, or the HTTP version. Again, no problem. But now, lots of us are replacing a lot of our APIs with microservices. So this is obviously great from my point of view because I like writing documentation. And presumably all of you are introducing microservice architectures because you too want to spend lots of your time writing HTTP API documentation for your microservices. If you don't want to spend lots of time writing API docs, you need a better way to write these docs because all of that deconstruction takes a long time. It's difficult. It's difficult to do consistently. And when you do this, you create API docs that are hard to use because they're all deconstructed and you have to put them together again. You have to work out how to go to the phrasebook from the deconstructed docs. So this is what I think is wrong with normal API docs, is that they are deconstructed, and this makes them harder to write, harder to produce, and harder to use. There is no win here. So I'm going to show you some examples of an idea I had. Let's start with one of these. So sometimes, you sit down at your desk in the morning and you just want to have a random GIF animation. So obviously, you go to giphy.com, you look up the API docs for the random GIF endpoint, right? That's what you do. So this is the API docs. Now, this is fairly normal API docs for an HTTP API. And it's nicely structured. Everything is split up and put in boxes. The boxes thing, it's a kind of container fetish. Developers love containers, even containers in documentation. Very structured, but it's deconstructed. So the different parts of the HTTP request are split up into different places. And even some things, like the example response, is not even here. There's hyperlinks. And it takes you somewhere else that shows what the response looks like. It doesn't even show it in JSON format. It shows a data dictionary in some other format. Even the JSON has been deconstructed. I mean, JSON itself is already a bit deconstructed. So this is pretty good documentation, but it has this problem of everything being split up. And this is not even very complex. It's not a complex API. A more complex example is the GitHub API. Here is the API for creating a new repository. To create a GitHub repository, you have very similar content. There's web stuff, there's parameters, there's a whole list of parameters, so it's more complex. There's a longer list of parameters. I like these docs a little bit more because it shows what the JSON actually looks like that you're going to get back. So this is the example response. But the end result is similar. There's more. So here I had to zoom out a bit more than on the previous one to fit it all in. This is the API for this one request. Create a GitHub repo. These are good docs, and this is a good API. So this is sort of the starting point. But also, when I started to point out how the deconstruction works, I realized that this is one of the things that I didn't like about using these kinds of API docs. I have to, I know how to use my web API, my client API, so I know how to make an HTTP request. I specify the HTTP method, I give it the URL, I add the headers and the other parameters and stuff, but I have to go hunting for these things. And then there are other things like the authentication and the error handling and how do I specify content types that in this case are even somewhere else. They're not here. And they're not here because GitHub has lots of different URLs, different resources that you can use, but they all do authentication in the same way. So that's sort of somewhere else. It's a common thing. So everything is spread around. That makes it more convenient to write so you don't repeat yourself as a writer. As a user of this documentation, the experience is not great. It could be better. So I started thinking about how it could be better, and I came up with an idea that to me looks like flattened documentation, which is why I call it flat HTTP API docs. Now, before you ask, because any moment now somebody will want to put their hand up and say, can we generate this? You cannot generate documentation. So I'm sorry. I know nobody wants to hear this as a programmer, but there is no such thing as generated docs because you cannot generate words and spaces. You can generate layout, you can generate structure, you can generate all sorts of containers and boxes and things, but they're all empty. You can generate Java doc from the methods, but there are no actual sentences in that documentation, and that documentation is fairly useless. You might as well just read the code. Same with these docs. So there is maybe a story about generating the stuff I want to show you, but not today, not yet. What I in fact did was I was testing an API using a client command line tool that would query the API. I'm not using curl because curl has great functionality, horrible developer experience. Nobody can remember the command line switches and how to use it. This is HTTPy. Who knows about HTTPy? Okay, that's a nice number, but it's less than half. So you need to go and look up httpy.org. It's great. When you use HTTPy with the verbose option, it prints the whole HTTP request when you make the request. The first line is the header, the request line, then the headers, then the request body in this case, because I'm creating a repo. And it shows you the response as well, the status line, the response headers, and you keep going, and eventually, because there's lots of response headers, it seems, from GitHub, you get the actual JSON response as well. This is much easier to understand. Well, it's much easier to understand provided that you already understand HTTP pretty well. So if you're an HTTP web developer, you probably get familiar with this stuff. I mean, so as a quick show of hands, who's familiar with what this stuff looks like? Right, everybody. So it doesn't matter what programming language you use. If you're using web APIs, you recognize this stuff. This is what's underneath. A lot of web APIs, especially in Java world, try to hide this. The servlet API has decided that this is a detail that should be hidden. But this is much easier to understand than the Java servlet API. So that kind of didn't work. Also, you're not necessarily using Java because there are more languages. You might be doing stuff in JavaScript on the client. So in the end, this becomes fairly understandable. I mean, the only problem with this is that this was pretty long. There's a bit too much here. But it's a start, because at least it's very clear. And so when I was sort of documenting a particular API, this was my starting point. OK, what actually happens? What does it actually look like? I realized that from an API documentation point of view, I don't need all of this. So the left-hand side is the original. But on the right-hand side, I've discarded all of the headers that are not really interesting from the point of view of the user of the API. Because there's lots of stuff there that I don't really care about just yet. Now I get a lot less. Now I'm starting to have an interesting idea. All I need to do is now copy the title and the one-sentence description from the official docs. And I've got something much shorter. And it's less deconstructed, or even it's not deconstructed at all, because this is the literal HTTP. So this is the literal request with some headers missing, and the top two lines, the title and the short description. So this was not a hard thing to do. I mean, I literally copy-pasted this from my command line output from HTTPy. And I didn't need to do a lot of writing if this was my own API, one sentence. And this is already, in some ways, better than the average HTTP docs. It's not great. I mean, it has problems, but it's a start. So this is the idea I had, which is this presentation. The next step is, well, how can I make this usable? How can I make this better? If I zoom in on the request part there, partly so you can read it at the back, I realized that one of the problems is that I haven't explained the parameters. I mean, I'd have to just know. There's no explanation of what's going on there in the authorization header. And that was one of the things that is there in the official docs somewhere, or somewhere else. There's a description that's needed there. And before somebody at the back tries to hack me, that's not my real password, by the way. Or my real authentication token in the previous slide. But I can solve that by adding a table of parameters, because this is the missing documentation, that you need to know that this is a personal access token or an OAuth token, for example. And I need to know, in case I didn't recognize it, that this is HTTP basic authentication. So this is better. I mean, I can keep the literal request, but I can then add the missing information around it. And so using this, I can then have all of the information from the original docs. So I thought I'd explore this a bit further. If I go back to the Giphy API, if you're requesting random GIFs, then you do need to specify some more parameters. And the query string gets all a bit mixed up. So this slide didn't work until I highlighted in red the parameters that I was putting in the table. It still works in the table because they still have names. I can still see names in the request. So I kind of like this because it's a bit more concise. And the request itself is really quite short when it's just a GET request. So far, so good. But there's a problem. Some of the URLs don't have named parameters. They have path parameters. I suppose it's the GIF ID. That's what's in the documentation there. But I can't look at the request and see what it's called. We had to invent this name, GIF ID, in the documentation. That's not in the literal HTTP. So I've got a naming problem. And naming is famously hard. And we do not want to add naming problems to documentation, which is hard enough, especially if you don't like it as much as I do. So the obvious solution is to kind of cheat, right? So cheating means not having a name at all and just having the value and just finding the same value. This is not too tricky. I just need to make sure that in my docs, these IDs look obviously different. I mean, I'll just check the first letter. One starts with H, one starts with Z. So, okay, I mean, I can work around these problems. I can make this documentation usable. But in many ways, I still have this separation, and it's got this table. It looks a little bit too much like JavaDoc. And that's not what I wanted. I didn't want this to look like JavaDoc. My next insight was to realize that I've got a bit more freedom than I thought I had in how I actually put this together. Now, here I've been mocking these up in Keynote on my Mac for the presentation, but I was also trying this in Markdown. I was trying this in wiki pages, thinking about where would I put this documentation, how would I write it, and realized that I was constraining myself unnecessarily because I remembered that what I really want to do is do what you would do on a whiteboard. This is not the way you would draw this on a whiteboard. On a whiteboard, I would just draw an arrow and just annotate the things. This is much easier to read. So now I really have to forget about how I'm producing these docs because Markdown isn't giving me this anytime soon. But that's not the problem I'm trying to solve here. So let's forget producing for now. Let's focus on the reader. If this is public API docs, then I just want them to be as good as they can be. And so let's directly annotate the values. This takes up way less space, and it's way easier to use. And it looks kind of cool. And I get to play with the arrows and see how they curve. I mean, I spent way too long deciding just, how to make the arrow work. This is just the request. So if I add the response, this still works. Now it starts to fit on the screen a bit. Now this is an API for fetching a GIF animation, remember. But the response is just a whole load of JSON. That doesn't really tell me, what is the image I've fetched? What is the animation I've fetched? Should I maybe annotate the response too? You bet I should absolutely annotate the response, because then I can do this. This is way more cool than API docs normally are. And I can highlight the most interesting thing in the response. It's all about the GIF. Everything else is a detail, maybe important details, dimensions and alternative URLs and such. But I can annotate the important thing. So this is where I start to feel that I'm onto something. So now I want to try it on the other APIs and see how well this works. It turns out when I've got more parameters, being able to do two-dimensional layout, lets me completely make everything fit. It's not a problem. I can still use the arrow thing. And it looks nice. It's a bit more visually interesting. API docs normally look boring. The other thing that's obviously great about this is that this takes up way less space than the original documentation. It's going to fit on the screen once I figure out how to actually produce it. I don't know. I'm going to have to, anyway. But that's another story, probably involving SVG. Because I've got more space, and because we all have enormous monitors these days, I can do something that we don't normally do. I can use columns and put things to the side. I mean, we're so used to looking at code in a single column, we forget that when you open a book, they might go sideways in the layout. So as well as drawing arrows, I can start to do layout. Now I'm doing DTP, which I hadn't done since the 90s or something. DTP is back. Just because I can't do it in Markdown doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, you know, pick up your glossy magazine. That wasn't done in Markdown. There is this whole discipline of layout and typography out there. And so this lets me put in the annotations that describe more detail and link to even more detail. So I can have this layered structure. If I'm familiar with the API or I've got basic questions, I just look at the basic stuff on the left. And more detail is on the side. And I can do other cute things. I mean, these are APIs that return JSON. But what if the API is going to return an image? I obviously just inline that. I mean, you know, not just as an excuse to put more cute kittens in the presentation, but because this is, and it communicates better what's going on. I wish the command line did this as well. I mean, on my system, HTTP does not do this, but it absolutely should. This, by the way, is the excellent cat API that you should use for all of your API testing and examples. So thank you, Sarah. So to summarize what I've got so far, I've focused on the literal request and response as the basis of the explanation, because I think that documentation by example is clearer and more concrete and easy to use than documentation by deconstruction and introducing abstract concepts that I don't really need. The only concepts I should need should be the ones in the HTTP spec. On top of that, then, I've started to introduce a bit of layout and typography to make it readable. I've introduced some annotations to explain more, to include more of the documentation. And I've realized that I can add more things, like warnings or notes about the API, like the note about authorization on the right-hand side. And why am I happy about this so far? Because aside from fiddling with the arrows, which is a tools issue, this was much more straightforward to put together because I don't have to invent a deconstruction. I don't have to invent a way of laying out all of these bits of HTTP. Because not only is that a lot of effort, it's also something where I'm going to solve it differently to everybody else who does this. And that's why I don't like other people's API docs, because individually they seem okay, but they're not the same as each other. They all hide the request headers and the content types in different places, and I'm hunting when I'm using these APIs. And there's another thing that I started to think about at this point, and this is when I started thinking about design. We actually see the API by example. If you look at the Giphy API docs, you don't really see the API in any real sense. You don't see the HTTP. If it's a good design, that's kind of hidden. But what I want, especially as a user of APIs who designs APIs as well, I want good examples that I can be influenced by, be inspired by, and follow. And so I want the API docs to really show off the API. So that was what I got onto the next thing. And so I thought, okay, how does this work for some of the APIs that I've been using? I can have a checklist for things I want in the API. But unfortunately, not every API is great. And so my checklist becomes how to document bad APIs in an honest way. Honest API docs have this. They say, you know, we're going to use HTTP kind of wrong. So obviously, you shouldn't do that in your API. You should use the correct HTTP status code. If you haven't done that, I mean, that's like doing something bad in code. You know, you don't want to need the code comment. But if the code is bad, you need the comment. And yeah, the solution is to fix the code. But deleting the comment doesn't fix the code. That's not how it works. That's the wrong way around. So not saying this doesn't make the API better. If the API does this, the least you can do is be honest about it. And so this is a consequence of showing the literal HTTP. You see any ugliness that is there. So what's going to happen next, of course, is that if you can see the ugliness and you've got space to add annotations, then you've got space for this additional honesty. And if you've got development teams who are not documenting their own APIs because they've decided that they're going to get away with not writing documentation, but you're selling these APIs and it's public, then you're going to hire technical writers to do it. And the technical writers are going to raise bug reports. They're going to create JIRA issues about how your HTTP API is using HTTP ROM. The developers are going to ignore these, and then your technical writers are going to get passive-aggressive on you. And they're going to start doing things like this. They're going to document the API, and when something's a bit fishy, they're going to put in a warning. And they're going to say, by the way, as politely as they can manage, you may be expecting a 404 not found. If you request an evil plan from the Dr. Evil API, when you request an evil plan that does not exist, but in fact you're going to get a 500 server error. Obviously, Dr. Evil's API is an XML API, right? It's probably even SOAP, but that wouldn't fit on the slides, so you'll have to give me that. And so if you're going to do things like this, return error codes in the wrong place, then the least you can do in honest documentation is make it usable. And I would want to not need that annotation on the right-hand side. But if I need it, I need it. So I've got some more examples for you. And I enjoyed these slightly more than I ought to, for which I apologize. But I mean, this is the part where I can explain what I mean by good HTTP APIs. Don't do this stuff. Dr. Evil's API obviously wants you to delete evil plans in a post request because he doesn't know about HTTP delete requests, which is what you should be using. And if you send the wrong kind of request, you send delete because you're optimistic about that's how it's going to work. That is not the right response. It should say 405 method not allowed. And in general, if you're sending a request that is wrong, you want some kind of 400 error, or an error code starting with 4 something, that indicates that it's a bad request. Don't do this again. Why does this matter? I mean, I've had this conversation with developers. I've been that developer, for which I apologize to the people who use those APIs. It just works. But the thing is, yeah, it may just work, but I'm going to have to write a whole load more code on the client because I can't just check the response status. I've got to check more things. I have to create a huge amount of defensive client code for this API, which is not cool. And the worst thing I could do at that point is decide that it's because HTTP is bad and that I should therefore need to write a Java client library for this API so I can hide all of that nastiness that I have to implement to cope with this stuff. That is the wrong solution to the problem. Problem is to just, not create that problem in the first place. So here's another one. This is much more normal because obviously there are more HTTP status codes than anybody can remember. But actually, when you create something, there's a status code for that. If I create an evil plan, I want a 201 response. And I want to know where the new plan is. And there's a header for that. There should be a location header in the response to tell me the location of the new plan. A 200 response with some kind of URL is not it. Especially if the URL is not quite right, it's not quite the right URL. I mean, that kind of is. But what if it just said ID equals 2? Then I'd have to construct the URL, and I'd have to do more work. Why does this happen? This happens not because we have bad developers or because people are lazy, particularly. It's because a lot of APIs grow from there being a front end and a back end of a single app. And a team is writing an API to be consumed by themselves. And then later on, your client server, this sort of client server architecture makes somebody realize, oh, our customers are all asking for an API. We've just got a free API that we can just use for our customers. And it will be free, and we won't have to do any additional coding. This is irresistible from a product management point of view. But it turns out that there's no such thing as a free API because it will be like this. And you will spend an enormous amount of effort in technical writing and customer support fixing an API that is not designed for public consumption. So maybe try and write the good API in the first place. I mean, I don't know if that's a solvable or avoidable problem, but that's what happens every single time. So, at a certain point, the annotations are going to get more annoyed. The technical writers are going to start to vent a little bit. But I mean, it's a compromise. I mean, this is at least we know that the status that we need is 201. And if we can't change the status code because that would break the user interface that relies on everything being a success, At least we can put some information for the poor API user. And it turns out, although HTTP is fairly simple, there are lots of details that routinely get ignored by server APIs. That you can request JSON because that's what you would like to get. You say, give me a JSON response. And the correct response, if you can't do it, is a not acceptable header. There's a status. There's a 400 something not acceptable when we can't serve JSON. We've only got XML. You should return an error. What you should not do is to say, successful, here's some XML. Because you know what happens here? You get a JSON parse error, cannot parse object, starting with angle bracket. I've learned to recognize that JSON parse error message. That means, it's XML or HTML, isn't it? When we wanted JSON. And there are more subtle things that you can do that are not to do with using HTTP particularly wrong. But there are more things about the API you could explain. In an API, in a user interface, and you have a list, what order is the list in? There are various possible good answers, but random order is never a good answer. Random order is never the order you were looking for. So it would be nice if it was sorted somehow in a reliable way that you could use that, because it's an array, right? Otherwise, people will rely on this. I mean, if you really don't have an order, people are going to rely on it anyway, whatever it actually does. So, I mean, you could maybe not use an array, but people will rely on the order of the objects or something. I mean, your clients will do something perverse here. So if you really want random order, you're going to have to write extra code on the server that randomizes it deliberately so that clients don't rely on the order that actually gets. I've only heard of one people doing that, but I think that's the advanced, API, server API usage. I encourage such shenanigans. It keeps life interesting. How bad can it get? My most recent horror story is the story of mixing the formats. And if you mix the formats, you end up with something like this. That's what JSON looks like if you form encode it, because it's got lots of quotes and sort of characters in it that need to be escaped with hex encoding. So our plan is here is sort of the JSON that we want to send. This is not the way to create an API where you send JSON. It should just be a JSON body. Please don't do this. You could make it worse. You can do things like embedding XML in JSON, embed JSON in XML, mix formats. Please do not do this, because you're going to end up with docs that say things like this. And you're going to end up with office parties where somebody decides that your developers really need to watch this excellent song by Dylan Beattie. So I encourage you to go and look this up on YouTube if you haven't already seen it. This is a work of genius. I'm not going to sing it. It's a great song. So where does this come from? What does this mean for the future of software documentation? Documentation can be better than the kind of simple documentation that we produce in Markdown in a GitHub repo. Now, in technical documentation circles, site builders and Markdown in a GitHub repo, these are wonderful things. This is a very, very successful way of reducing the difficulty and cost of publishing documentation and allowing developers especially to use familiar authoring and publishing tools. So these are very, very good things. But for some documentation, it's not good enough. You wouldn't publish a book like that. If you want to publish a book like this, you need more sophisticated tools, especially for the cover of a book like this. What kind of software do you need to use for this? So on the one hand, we want to make it easier for people to write documentation. But sometimes you need more sophisticated documentation. So normally when I'm in a conversation about this topic, somebody, not that topic, but the API docs topic, somebody is going to mention Swagger. Bear in mind that I've mentioned there's no such thing as generated docs. So Swagger is like JavaDoc. It doesn't generate the docs, but it generates the target structure that you could write sentences to go into, but nobody ever does. I haven't often seen Swagger documentation with English sentences in it. Also, if I think about companies that have APIs that they're essentially selling access to, like GitHub and Spotify and Twilio, all these SaaS companies with their APIs, none of them publish documentation for the APIs using Swagger. That's not what Swagger is for. You need something more sophisticated. And so the future is more sophistication as a parallel path to easier, which is what Markdown gives you. And this particular book was in computer book circles kind of revolutionary back in 2003. This is possibly O'Reilly's best-selling book ever. This is apparently a screenshot of the cover of the Indian edition because it says 1 lakh copies sold. In the Indian numbering system, a lakh is 100,000. Now, 100,000 copies of a book is way more copies than you are likely to sell if you write a computer book for programmers. What this did is that this launched the Head First series, which does things like this, which was very weird. It was not what computer books normally did. Computer books normally just had lots of text and headings and code snippets. And a lot of people didn't like this. They said, well, it's treating us like children. But that's kind of exactly what it's doing for a very good reason. Textbooks for children are very sophisticated because they have to be, because learning is hard. And we want children to do a lot of it, and we want it to be effective. There's a lot of research about why this works better than the way computer books used to be. There is a good reason why this is the best-selling book on Java ever, probably. I'm not totally sure about that. But it's certainly up there, in the bestsellers. It's not a coincidence that it's directly annotating things and that it's making a clear distinction between the style, the typographical style of annotations and content. It's deliberately handwritten annotations. This is what we do at a whiteboard. This is because Kathy Sierra, who wrote this, she looked into the research. She figured out this was probably a good idea. Well, it turns out O'Reilly's subsequent success with the Head First series made it a good idea. And so this is one of the sources of my idea for the FHAD HTTP API documentation. Because a few years ago, I worked on a book, not with Kathy, but with the co-author, Bert Bates, who said, we should more directly annotate things in the book. This is something that Kathy invented in the Head First series. We should think about doing this. We didn't do it very much. Mostly we had a kind of boring book with code snippets, but we should have. It's not too late. The second best time is now, right? So the future. We keep using Markdown and restructured text and AxiDoc because they are great things. They help you focus on just writing the words. That's what's great about them. Because if you give people word processors, they fiddle with the formatting. That's also what's wrong with presentation tools like PowerPoint. It requires huge discipline not to spend 90% of your time on the animations. And fiddling with the arrows, so not true story. So that reduces the cost of getting these docs out there. And for a lot of documentation, that is great, and that's all you need. But there is more. There's more than all of that. And so this is the slide that I kind of haven't written yet, is how am I going to produce these documentation, the API docs? Initially, the tools of the word processors and Adobe InDesign for doing the proper layout or Illustrator or something. This is the basic tools for doing proper layout and design. But actually, CSS has become very sophisticated. Chances are you can somehow make this work just in CSS. And if you can't, you can definitely do it in SVG. So kind of the next step is to get a tool like Illustrator that can save SVG and figure out how to best embed that in a web page. But here's a free startup idea for all of you. Is to figure out how to write some software that creates this documentation in a nice web interface. Because that will definitely take over the world. Now, sadly, and I normally carefully avoid this, I've left time for questions. I warn you, though, if you ask me about Swagger, I'm going to remind you that... does anyone have any questions? Preferably actual questions rather than just blog posts. Yes?
So I like your idea about example documentation, but what if you have multiple different combinations of query parameters? Do you then have a lot of examples?
The question is, what if I need different combinations of query parameters? This is also true if I need to show different possible error scenarios. Yes. I think the answer is to just have multiple examples. In all of these examples, I showed one request and one response. I think in reality, it would be very helpful to include 5 or 10. It's going to take more space, but space is kind of free. And they're fairly compact. So yeah, you're going to need more than one example per URL. Another question at the front.
What about conversations? You mentioned at the start that JavaDoc doesn't really help you usually when you want to implement some code. I usually end up at Stack Overflow and I see some lines combined with, well, it's sort of the conversation you mentioned in the Penguin book. That helps me getting something done. Can you encode conversations?
So do you mean human conversations?
No, well,
Or
conversations as in I visit one URL, I get something back.
okay, the question is, can I encode HTTP conversations? Can I encode a session? It's obviously a trick question because HTTP is stateless and there is no session. There is no such thing as the HTTP session. That's a Java Servlet API invention, and that is the path to broken APIs. So other than authentication tokens, which maybe you put in cookies, which is built into HTTP, there is no conversation. So I don't think you need to do it. Yeah, I believe that that's not actually necessary. At the back.
So in actually writing this documentation or drawing, I want to start using this. So maybe CSS and HTML. Do you think that we need to keep it basic and just one picture with arrows, or I'm imagining these tags with pop-ups and stuff? What is your thought on that? Simple or complex?
The question is, to actually start using this and to start trying to do this in HTML and CSS, do you keep it simple? Do you think about drawing the arrows? Do you use pop-ups? Do you make it interactive? I'm not sure. This is where I'm hoping that other people with more spare time than me do some experimentation. My initial focus is to think of this in terms of print design. Imagining that I want to put it on a page. And so I ignored the dimension of being able to click on things. But that might be a very useful way of doing it, making all of the highlighted bits, all of the pink highlights, clickable. And that means you don't need the arrows. So that might be a great way to do it in HTML, CSS, make everything pop-ups. But I'm not sure, because you'd have to scrub everything with the mouse cursor to find things. So I'm sort of hoping that there's some clever way to actually draw the boxes. Maybe what would be cute would be if the boxes attached to an arrow were sort of floating and you could drag them around, or if they floated around and moved out of the way when you kind of pointed at them or something. Because it would be nice to be able to see them all at the same time. But that probably requires SVG magic rather than just HTML, CSS. Try it out, send me an email or a tweet and let me know, please. Yes?
Should this documentation be embedded in the programming code or even the other way around, like literate programming, which Donald Knuth did in the 1980s?
The question is, should this be embedded in the code somehow, in the implementation? Should it consider Knuth's literate programming? I think the answer is no, because the implementation is not something that I ought to care about if I'm a user of the API. Sometimes the user is also the writer of the code, and then that may be a good idea. And I've often wondered why Knuth's literate programming didn't take off, because it's so wonderful I can write docs and code at the same time. That would be great. But then that's how I realized that that's why it doesn't take off, because that's just me. And the rest of you do not want to write the documentation part. You just want to write the code part. So you really don't care about this idea of literate programming. I'm assuming that's why it didn't take off. And so although there is the occasional developer who's going to be writing these docs, I'm mostly now thinking about the scenario of published API docs where it's important that they're high quality and you've probably got technical writers involved. You certainly do at the big companies that have SaaS APIs. Question?
Do you think an API documentation like this will work as a reference guide? Because I'm afraid there will be quite a mess if you want to document all the parameters on all HTTP requests over and over again. And it will be very hard to use this as a reference guide when you're already somewhat familiar with the API and just want to look up the single parameter.
Can you use this as a reference guide? Wouldn't that be too much of a mess, too complex? That's the question. I don't know, because I haven't tried it out enough. You may well be right. it is a bit suspicious that this isn't going to work as a reference guide. So I have a couple of thoughts. One is that if you have so many parameters like you do in the git create repo URL, maybe you have too many parameters. Maybe this is visibility of a bad API. Maybe this is like looking at JavaDoc and saying, oh, this method has 20 parameters. So I hope that the answer is that this is just having discovered that you need to change the API, not to just document that. Maybe the other answer is that there is more than one kind of documentation. There's reference documentation, there's tutorial documentation, there's learning documentation. And so maybe in the end you need both kinds. And particularly you mentioned parameters. Parameters are often part of a data model. The documentation that we usually most need in API docs like this is the most old-fashioned thing, a data dictionary. You know, I get how the HTTP part works. I can send the request, but I get this block of JSON back with all of these named properties. I have no idea what any of them mean. I have to guess. And so maybe documenting the data model as a data dictionary, which is usually tabular, not annotated like this. Maybe that's what we really need in the reference guide, and that's separate to the API documentation. So that's another possibility. But again, I don't know until I actually do this. I mean, I'm just making stuff up here. I think we've got time for one more question. One more question there. Or maybe two.
API documentation as well. My biggest issue always is keeping all the examples up to date. I mean, just last minute before release of a new API version, somebody changes one field from optional to required. It's like, oh, that's not a new field, and you forget half of the examples. And then your examples aren't complete. Any tips on keeping those in sync? And I mean, it's something that should be taken into account.
So the question is, how do you keep examples up to date? Two ways. One is you have the minimum amount of documentation that you need. Too much documentation is even worse than too much code. It's even less likely to be maintained. And the other thing you can do is just make it as easy as possible to update the examples. So this helps a bit because if the API changes in traditional API documentation, you have to make lots of changes all over the place. And so at least hopefully here, you're merely running the request again and capturing the actual output from my HTTP tool or similar, because you can do this in Postman too. Making it easier to update. That is where I would like some cleverer way of having the arrows drawn automatically, because otherwise I'll be fiddling with the position of those pink boxes. Like literally I had to kind of position pink boxes on my slides to make that work. So that's the answer. Make it easy to make the updates and try and not, and have a balance in how many examples. So I think maybe manage, hold on. Was there a question, is it short?
Well, yeah, it could be short. So
Ask the short version.
yeah, so now we are used as a user to read documentation, like different layouts. Isn't it time to move forward and maybe make videos about how we should use our APIs?
The question is, should we not move on from documentation to make videos? Please, no, stop with the videos thing. I do not want to watch a video. I want to read text. So I'll leave you with that. No. If you have suggestions, come and see me afterwards. If you're too shy to ask in front of everybody else, come and see me afterwards. Bring me your questions. Ask me on Twitter. I have a website if you want to know who I am, which saves some time on the introductions. Otherwise, thank you very much.